MICA, the new regulatory framework in Europe. MICA stands for Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, and this is something that keeps up a lot of people in Europe who has crypto investments. Now the question is, what is this regulatory framework, what it means for your crypto bags, what exchanges you might be able to use, and also why there is a possibility that DeFi is not even included. I sat down with an expert, Juan from MICA Crypto Alliance, to discuss everything there is. I hope you're going to enjoy this interview. Let's get going. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be invited.
Awesome having you on. So we met in Monaco, the crypto conference, and you had something to say which actually sparked my interest, and we had a little bit of a chat there, which was that the US is actually not even that far ahead, and the EU is much more ready with the regulatory framework. And I started to think, because the media and what we see from the outside, the packaging looks a little bit different. So I really want to deep dive into that as well. But before we get going, first of all, can you just brief what you're doing, who you are and what you do briefly, and then just tell us what MICA is?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Juan I Ibanez. I'm the General Secretary of the MICA Crypto Alliance. So the MICA Crypto Alliance is an initiative where we are helping layer ones, layer twos, offerers, issuers, and CASPs, crypto asset service providers, not just comply with MICA, but also develop and implement best practices in compliance of MICA. Because MICA is an opportunity, the way we see it, to also show to what extent this sector can level up, can raise the bar and raise to the occasion of not just, treating regulation as a tick the box exercise where you do the bare minimum, but also show the power and the responsibility and the maturity of the sector at this stage. But at the same time, people need help. It's a complex regulatory regime to navigate. So we are working with them to assist the industry and to help them develop best practices and get there.
I wrote a complete thread on this. I deep dive into it when it was back in December. I made a whole thread explaining what it is, but I think a lot of people actually forgot it. It was a buzzword. It was, a lot of people talked about it at the time. Oh my God, MICA is happening now and it's gonna be the end of the world in the EU. Can you tell us what MICA is today? Because a lot of things has changed.
Yeah, I like to explain it like this. MICA is the banking grade regulation for crypto in the EU, with the good and the bad that this implies. So MICA stands for Markets in Crypto Assets. In fact, it's a copy or a semi-copy of an existing regulation called MiFID, Markets in Financial Instruments Directive. So there was already a regulation for financial instruments, and this regulation has been sort of copied and adapted to crypto, and this is what gave birth to MICA. Now, what does MICA do? It is so comprehensive. That's why it's a leading regulation that is hard to summarize. But the main thing that it's a licensing regime, right? So it's a regime of authorizations. If you have the authorization that MICA establishes, you can operate in the EU. If you don't have it, you cannot operate in the EU. Now, of course, then there's a lot of additional requirements that come with that. What situations you don't need an authorization for, where if you have an authorization, you need to meet like ongoing regulatory requirements. What happens if you are outside of the EU and you want to access the European market? So those requirements include like principles of consumer protection, of transparency, of governance. There's a bit of cybersecurity there. And a very important aspect of it is the stablecoin regulation aspect. One of the things that officers from the European Union sometimes tell you in private is we stop treating MICA as a stablecoin regulation because everybody's talking about MICA as a stablecoin regulation, and it's much more than that. But it's true that it's ended up being very stablecoin heavy. And when we had that conversation at this conference recently, the EU didn't have a stablecoin regime as mature as it has now, because new things have happened with Genius and so on in the US since.
Yes.
So I would say the United States has really caught up in stablecoin regulation at this point, but there's the rest, right? So on the rest, there's a lot of requirements, procedures to follow for crypto asset service providers, for consumer information. Some things the US won't do because they are not interested in doing them. Some they would like to sort out, and we need to wait until the US has a more final regime, let's say.
So it's very interesting because what I feel or what I see when I meet with people is that, you know, we do the live shows every day and we talk to a lot of people in schools, and so people say that, oh my God, I can't access exchanges from Spain, from the Netherlands, from this place, from the UK, from here and there. And then I think we're in a transitional phase. If you look at it, so officially the US closed down a long time ago when the previous administration was on. They said no leverage trading, no access to non-crypto exchange, non-US based crypto exchanges, just like Coinbase, Gemini, so on. And then they just simply closed down. But in the EU, there was no, so to say, closure on it. They were like, okay, we are in the making of this thing, and then you will be able to, and when it comes, we start implementing. And this is why it's kind of coming as a shocker for a lot, because this becomes, so December 13th, I believe it was implemented or something like that. And then now it's becoming enforced. How do you see the landscape when it comes to crypto and individual countries within the EU and the overall landscape when it comes to exchanges, users? How does this unfold?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is basically geofencing. I'm in the UK actually, and in the UK we have it even worse, right? Every time I try to access a website from an exchange, for so many cases, I just get this huge banner saying, sorry, this page is restricted for UK individuals, and I need to use a VPN to even read a homepage for just basic research. And this is because, well, in the UK, there's also some requirements that companies haven't met yet, and to avoid exposing themselves to any sort of liability, they just block access to the UK. We are going to see a bit more of geofencing in the EU also in the coming months, because you say correctly that it's partially being enforced, right? Countries are learning to enforce it. We need to understand that it's such a comprehensive and complex regime that even the regulators themselves, they don't know everything that's going on. So they are learning to enforce it, right? Just like the companies need to learn what to comply with. Well, the regulators, they also don't know like when they need to issue a fine and so on.
Yo guys, I just wanted to pop in here for 1 second and tell you that our school is starting literally on Monday. So I didn't know when this is going to come out, but now I know, so this is why I'm sitting in a car. But I want to tell you, we have a free school if you want to learn about crypto. There's a link in the description, on the top of the description, that you can click on and you can enroll for free. And we're going to teach you everything about crypto, how you can get onboarded, how to use wallets, what is DeFi, how does the whole thing work, and why it's worth still looking at investing in crypto. So link in the description. Even if you know crypto, send it to someone who doesn't and they need to catch up. But let's get going on the episode. I hope you're enjoying it. One of the biggest things that I've seen in the EU, and I'm based in the EU as well, when this regulation comes in, we're talking, so in the US, that's still one, yes, you do have individual states, but it's still one umbrella. So when a Genius Act passes, that we've seen the stablecoin legislation, or when a Clarity Act passes, that's on a nationwide agreement on what the framework is. But we're looking at the EU, and it's a complete different setup, because you have an EU legislative framework, and within that, you have 28, 29 countries that are individually governing their own regions. So the problem with overregulation, and this is what I actually wanted to tap onto this, and it's interesting that you said that there will be more geofencing coming, is that how will this framework be? How can the countries decide what parts of MICA they comply with, what parts they don't comply with, or how does that work?
Yeah. So the EU, in fairness, they have tried to get closer to the US level of interoperability. It is a great step forward compared to the previous condition of the EU, but it's not as unified as the United States. So MICA, you cannot choose what parts you comply with or not, unless you are one of the countries outside the EU, but in the EEA area, and you decide to adhere to MICA. But every country, they get to implement MICA. So MICA will establish the requirements in regulations, but then the general regulations, the specific process, the details on what this means in practice needs to be implemented by a national competent authority, an NCA, and that's where there's one per country, right? So there's a couple dozen NCAs, and these leads in differences in regimes, right? Because an NCA could be a central bank or a financial supervision authority, whoever the country decides you are in charge of crypto in this country, they will establish processes, right? So MICA will say, well, you need to get a license, and to get the license, you need to present a reserve management plan, a recovery plan, governance framework that is transparent. But how do you present that? In what format? What is going to be considered good enough or not good enough? Well, that's for the NCAs to establish. So after MiCA, you need to pass a national law, and then based on the national law, the national competent authorities can specify the law even further. So that's like a cascade of regulation, and some countries have begun to implement and others have not. And in fact, MiCA allows for countries to establish a transition period while they come up with the implementation. So many countries started giving themselves a 6-month period to implement MiCA. Well, as we are seeing now, it happened in Lithuania, it happened in Italy. They reached the deadline and they were unable to come up with an implementation of their regulation. So they had to extend the transitional regime for another 6 months or so until they come up with something. So this creates uncertainty because even until the very last day, we didn't know if the regime would be implemented and how. That said, there is in the EU what you call passporting. So if you get your license, say in Italy, you don't then need a license in France. You can use your Italy license to access, say, the French market.
As a provider?
As a crypto as a service provider, yes.
Okay, let me understand this. So if I'm a company registered in Spain and I acquire a MiCA license in France that has different regulations, I can operate within the entire EU.
As far as MiCA is concerned, yes, and that's what you call passport. So in that sense, it is similar to the US, and this is actually the achievement of MiCA. All the overregulation and all the difficult things you see about it have been the price to pay for this. However, MiCA doesn't really operate in a vacuum. There's other regulations going on at the same time. And like maybe a supervisory authority of France is going to come and say, well, but you're violating this other French law that you didn't know of. So I don't care about your Spanish license. You're still in trouble. That's, of course, what we want to harmonize. So even though there is passporting in principle, there's a harmonization challenge in practice. Now, at the same time, this creates interesting incentives, because if you are a country where you make it easy to come in and register, you can become a very important hub to attract companies from outside the EU to enter the EU via your country. But this creates suspicions from the other countries saying, well, maybe companies are coming into your country because it's not like you are making it efficient to register. You're not doing a good job at supervising. So you are sort of becoming, a hub for illicit activity. So we don't.
Now,
like
what defines that? That's the question. Because the first thought what I had was, okay, things that there will obviously be. So if you look at Dubai as like being the hub for crypto, if you look at some of the other regions in the world, you're gonna have these hubs in Europe as well, based on what you're saying. So is that something that is already happening? Are there any countries that are much further in the process with very good clarity and circumstances than others?
Yeah, there's definitely countries that are much, much more ahead than others. I'm not going to say which countries are behind because I don't want to name and shame, but I can tell you some of the countries that are looking forward, right? And imagine some of these countries, they have a competent authority that does not even have a crypto team. So they don't have even a single full-time person in charge.
But how can it be? But how can that happen that they have a deadline, they implement MiCA, and still to this day, 7 months later, after the final deadline of MiCA, there is no person in charge? How is that even possible?
Well, technically, there is a person in charge. It's just that they have so many other things, and they are not a full-time person on that, which is crazy, right? So there's even the practical aspects of what it looks like to supervise a sector. So any mature, well-informed regulator will have, or competent or supervisory authority, they will have a team that only works with crypto. And this team will have, even licenses for analytics software. Like they will have, I don't know, Chainalysis or something like that.
Yes.
They need to know what's going on. I can assure you, in many of these countries, they don't even have a license to any of these platforms, right? They don't know what's going on. So which countries are doing better? Well, I can think of Liechtenstein, for instance. They have a team that is very savvy, that's very well informed, or Malta, but also France, right? France is a country you often associate with over-regulation. However, Circle got their license, was the first one to operate there, and they have a very interesting research team over there. I think Luxembourg is doing something interesting now. So what makes an authority good, right? It's not that simple. It's not as easy as having low taxes. You need to issue guidance, right? There's regulators that in their website, they publish even letters, PDFs, Q&As, explaining like how do you sort out processes of the registration, and they make it clear what you need to do. And if you have questions, they will answer your emails or they will take a phone call. So that's super important when you are trying to come up with a license, because if it's denied, you don't get enough information on how to fix it, then even if the taxes are low or something, you cannot get the license. There's some countries that they are charging just for the application, and what they're charging for the application is not cheap. But because the authority is well informed, is communicating, and they actually understand blockchain, they are doing a better job. Now, we have seen even just, I think it was less than 10 days ago, ESMA, which is the European Securities and Markets Authority, and it's an implementing regulator for the entire EU. It started clashing a bit with the Malta Authority, the MFSA, the Malta Financial Services Authority. And, you know, there's been this rumor lately that people are coming in to Malta to register because Malta is just being sloppy in the supervisory process. So ESMA did a sort of audit of Malta. And what we saw there was very interesting because they published the results of this sort of audit, not in extreme detail, like with the names of the companies, but they said, well, we looked at how you were approving or denying registrations. And overall, things tend to look good. So you are doing a good job. But, you know, there's some things in the registration process where you could deny the license until the company fixes this issue. And you could use the threat of rejecting the licensing application for them to fix it. Whereas the Malta Authority approach is more like, well, there's tools that are more appropriate for a given problem. Approving or denying a license is one sort of tool for one sort of caliber of problems. And there's other obligations that can be resolved via ongoing monitoring. So there's a difference of degree here, right? ESMA, maybe the more pro-regulation side of the EU, wants to hold the threat of license revocation or license rejection over your head as a threat for you to comply with more things, whereas in more market-friendly jurisdictions, maybe the approach is a bit more like ongoing regulation works for this. And there is going to be a political fight on where you draw the line. Where's the limit when it's too much in one direction or not? So that's something that we're going to see in the future.
What would you suggest for people in the EU to start looking into when it comes to MICA and their crypto assets?
Yeah, you're right. We need to define what people are. Are we talking about issuers? Are we talking about crypto?
Talking about retail. Yeah, I'm talking about retail investors.
Well, the retail investors, they're just going to retain access to the exchanges. If one of the exchanges that they are currently using, or the crypto as a service providers more generally, does not get their license, there is going to be a transition out. They are going to take their funds out of this entity, but there is a process for these things, so people don't just like lose access to the money because their exchange failed to secure a license. Similar thing happens, you know, with stablecoins. So one of the most important requirements of MICA is that stablecoins, they need to have reserves in the EU. And you need to segregate the reserves, put them in European banks to satisfy any redemption requirements from the European users. But how do you do that if stablecoins are global, right? In fact, it's an approach that is not scalable, because if every country does this, then a stablecoin needs to have 200 bank accounts in each one of the countries and be rebalancing every day. It's impossible to do that. The whole point of this technology is that it's global. So as a result of this, for instance, USDT has been delisted already from the EU. And you were asking about timelines. Like MICA, most of MICA has already been implementing, and there will be more to it. So what happens if you are an EU retail investor and you have USDT? Have you lost it? Has it disappeared? No. Well, even like your crypto as a service provider will still hold the USDT in your behalf. They're still allowed to do that and to allow you to withdraw this. But
you're just not able to actually use it, cannot trade it, cannot convert it, cannot do all that. We saw that with Revolut just happening now. One of the crazier things that I wanted to mention, talking about stablecoins, is Lagarde and his comment about a CBDC. And we see the Genius Act basically prohibiting, so to say. Now, there is this controversy if it is, but there is the anti-CBDC plan as well. They're going to implement it in a defense bill as well. So there is a framework to make it impossible for the government to create a CBDC, whereas in Europe, we see a little bit of a different direction with Lagarde's statements of having a digital euro coming maybe as soon as October. What do you think about that? And what does the MICA regulation include on CBDCs?
Yeah, MICA does not include anything on CBDCs, but we do see a clash between the European Central Bank and ESMA, right? So I would say that the sector, the part of the EU public sector that has been involved in MiCA is more pro-crypto than the European Central Bank and more pro-stablecoin than the European Central Bank. So one of the things that we are seeing now, and it's a huge fight that is very related to this, related to how you interpret this reserve segregation requirement in MiCA for something called the double issuance problem. So if an issuer of a stablecoin has an entity in the EU and an entity outside of the EU, and imagine, for instance, but just one example among many, Circle. Circle has a company in the US that it serves their global customers, but also they have Circle France issuing a MiCA compliant version of USDC in the EU. But the two versions of this stablecoin, they're completely fungible, right? You have never said, gone to Circle to redeem your USDC and said, oh, well, this USDC has been issued by Circle France, and they've never told you, oh, excuse me, you need to go back to France to get that redeemed. That would never work, and that is not how MiCA is interpreted. But the European Central Bank is pushing for interpretation that these two versions of the coin should be unfungible. You should have, for instance, USDC US and USDC EU, right? Which is kind of crazy, right? Which would push even compliant stablecoins out of the European market. Or
yeah, but probably that's the point. Probably that's the point, because then they can introduce a digital euro. Isn't that the idea?
Yeah, it would definitely reduce the utility of stablecoins in the EU. Interestingly, it would also reduce the power of even euro-denominated stablecoins, because they can also not go out, like outside the EU and have reserves somewhere else. The European Central Bank is making the argument that it's a risk to stability if customers from another jurisdiction try to redeem in a European bank.
Yeah, but that's what I don't buy that. You know, that's the problem.
Yeah,
That's what exactly. Exactly. They just want to create a CBDC, and they are packaging it in a way that is going to be fantastic for retail. But that's one of the major issues that I see with MiCA. And again, I'm not an expert. This is why I'm very happy that you're on the show, because one of the biggest things that everybody was like, what are the two main things that everybody is going on and on about crypto? One is really the self-custody and the right to DeFi, right? To actually be able to use decentralized finance in any way, because that takes us further. That makes everything cheaper, faster, obviously decentralized. And the second one is relating to that is stablecoins. So we see the advancement in the US. We see Trump's motives on making the dollar the dominant currency of the world, and one of the avenues for that is to make it available around the world. But what I see is the EU, even though it's creating these regulations, it's kind of closing in and focusing much more again on compliance and regulation for the people, but not for the people. You know what I mean? So how will this? How do you see from discussions and closer discussions that you're involved in? Do you see a trajectory where the EU is actually going to force out stablecoin issuers and just focus on a CBDC, which is a digital euro?
It's a political fight. It's an issue right now. It's a battle on the interpretation of MiCA. So you can interpret a priori these in two directions: the direction that allows you to have a double issuance and the direction that does not. And we need to see where this goes. And this is something that happens a lot with the EU. It also, there's this thing also. There's this discussion, is there going to be a MiCA 2.0? Is one of the questions that sometimes is being asked. And people are like, what? We're not finished. We cannot even implement the first one. And you're already thinking of a second one. Should we stop the regulation for a bit? But it is an interesting example to show how the EU operates. Even until a few months ago, it was very clear there was not going to be a digital euro. And similarly, people tell you even today, there's not going to be a MiCA 2.0. But just in case, there's working groups, in the European Parliament and European Commission that are just holding roundtables on how things would look like in case they are ever needed.
Maybe.
And the way in which the EU operates is one day they come up, like somebody from above comes up with the guidelines. We need this in a month. And what you have been doing for 2 years that everybody was telling you within the European Commission itself, this is not going to happen, suddenly happens. And this is the risk, right? It can happen like abruptly. It's not like a trajectory that is super clear, but it can happen sort of abruptly. And this is why also the industry needs to organize a bit to push back against some of these extreme interpretations. We also saw it with GDPR regulation. There was recently an opinion by one of the European regulators that about how you make blockchain compatible with European data protection laws, which say that you have the right to get your data deleted. So, but how do you delete data from an immutable blockchain? Well, the opinion from this regulator was just delete the entire blockchain then.
Exactly.
Which, of course, right? So you need to push back against these things because otherwise they get set in stone and they can really harm the industry. That's a risk. So back to like the original discussion that we were having, it's better to have a regime often than to have no regime. Companies ask you for something because otherwise then they get in trouble anyway, they get fines anyway, but they don't know what the rules of the road are. But there's other countries that have come up with a regime that is much simpler, that allows you to come in and register, that allows you to get your license, and that gives you some clarity, but it's not as complex as the EU regime. What's happening in the EU is that the regulatory regime tries to balance too many interests at the same time. So it's not like in Switzerland or in the UAE, where the goal is to create a clear regime and that's it. And this is a path to registration. It can be easier, can be harder, but it's the path. In the EU, we're balancing multiple interests. So yes, we need clarity for the crypto sector, but we also need consumer protection. We also need environmental protection. We also need financial stability. And we also need data protection. And they're trying to get one regulation and adjacent regulations together to balance all of these requirements at the same time, while at the same time having 30 countries with their own implementations and interpretations of each one of these. So that is what creates a degree of mess in the EU that you don't see in other places.
Incredible, incredible. I think we cleared out a lot of things and we're running out of time soon. We talked about a lot of concerns in this past 25 minutes. I also want to focus on the good things. So why do you believe MICA and what happened so far and what is going to happen is actually good for the European people?
You have a path to getting a license. You know more or less what you need to comply with to get a license, which gives you access to the entire European market if you have a license in just one of these European countries. That's a huge improvement versus the prior situation where this was not like that, right? So you could get access to one country, but only to one country, and the regime was different. So if you wanted to access the entire European market, you needed teams in the different countries. Now, there's many problems in how this has been implemented, but this is an improvement. There's also positive things in the aspects of MICA that have been left out. You mentioned DeFi. Well, MICA does not regulate DeFi. It explicitly excludes decentralized trading platforms from its scope. So I think that's a positive. It still allows you to have...
Hold on a second. This is news for me. So you're saying that the MICA compliance, when we're talking about trading, does that only relate to centralized exchanges?
Yes.
So if I want to... Okay, so if I was to use Jupiter, I was to use Phantom, if I was to use Uniswap, would that be an exception from MICA?
That is completely excluded from MICA as of now. But then there are some questions because it needs to be, according to MICA, fully decentralized. So where does, of course, decentralization, we know it's a continuum. In fact, it's a continuum in many dimensions. So there will be a fight for where do you draw the line. And will creating a front end towards a DEX count as a centralized service, or is that just
now who will decide it and when will that be decided?
Right, exactly. Or for instance, yeah, maybe Uniswap, the protocol is excluded, but the Uni token to be listed in Binance EU maybe requires a MICA white paper. It doesn't require a license, but it needs to comply. So is Binance going to write a white paper for the Uni token? No, they're probably going to go to Uniswap Labs and saying, hey guys, if you want your token listed, and this is just an example, right? Uni is probably already at Binance and they get a transition period. But the point is, even if you are excluded, you are going to be feeling the after effects. But yeah, one of the exclusions from MICA is DeFi. Another exclusion from MICA is NFTs, actually. Non-fungible tokens are not covered by MICA. Now, there's again an interpretation question there. What is non-fungible? It's a collection of semi-fungible NFTs. non-fungible or not. So you still have the question, but yeah, there's some exclusions, and that's a positive as well.
Two things. One, I want to go back because there was this massive discussion as well about Hungary. So I am Hungarian. And I've been following up. I don't know how familiar we are with what actually happened here, but the idea is that they just came out of nowhere. In 2 days, they passed the legislation that basically criminalizes crypto trading on a non-MiCA compliant platform. And there is no non-MiCA compliant Hungarian platform. So the idea here is that they need to, service providers need to validate themselves through the Hungarian authorities, and then that applies with MiCA regulation. But what is interesting with what you're saying now is that might not even be a problem even for the Hungarians, because you can use a MiCA compliant platform, and apparently DeFi is not included. Does that mean that if within MiCA DeFi is not a subject, or DeFi is not, or excluded from MiCA, does that mean that countries itself can regulate DeFi under the same umbrella? Or do you see that already happening?
Yeah, good. It's a very good question. And I have to say, I don't know all of the specifics of the Hungarian case. I think they have... In
general.
Yeah, the fact that DeFi is excluded from MiCA does not prevent a specific country from regulating it themselves. So I don't think there's a prohibition on regulating. So it could happen. In theory, but
do you see other countries already creating frameworks for DeFi infrastructure within Europe?
We are going to see some regulation at some point, not so far in the future, on legal structures and legal wrappers for DAOs that are very closely intertwined with DeFi projects. That is something that is going to happen. I know for a fact that there's working groups trying to understand the situation. The way in which we can think about this. Consider that if there is no regime to regulate DeFi, when eventually, if there is nothing, it will all be considered a simple partnership with full shared liability and no limitation in liability across all of the members. So the alternatives eventually are going to be you're being considered a simple partnership with solidary, complete liability, or there will be something else. So what is that something else going to look like? And there will be some regulation, but it could happen at a European level as well. It doesn't have to be at a country level specifically, but we'll see. It's hard to make predictions.
Juan, I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for jumping on. We are going to include your links in the description so people can check out what you do and connect to you. And yeah, thanks for being here. We will get you back whenever something happens on the show. And do you have any final thoughts you want to share with the audience?
It's been great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting. Again, the MiCA Crypto Alliance, what we are doing is we are helping projects, not with absolutely everything on MiCA. We are focusing on the weirder and funnier parts of MiCA, like the white papers or the sustainability indicators. We do a lot of sustainability research on crypto, also as a way of defending crypto from some excessive attacks, that crypto has received, trying to, with proper and fair science, defend the honor of the sector. So if you're interested in that, please reach out. If you're sharing the link, so I appreciate that as well. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And guys, thank you so much for watching. We truly appreciate you being here. Check out all the links in the description. Follow Juan, follow me on X, and we'll just come back with the next one. Subscribe to the channel, smash the like, and if you liked it, leave a comment. Thank you so much for watching. I believe I will see you in the next one.